Next up is Alex Tapscott. I met Alex for the first time in New York at Consensus. I stalked him, hunted him down, and found him, thanks to the help, aid of Pete Martin. Alex and his father, Don, wrote the best-selling book, The Blockchain Revolution, which you're witnessing here today in Cleveland. He's the co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute. And from that initial meeting in April, we have built this incredible partnership with the City of Toronto and with the Blockchain Research Institute that anybody in Cleveland, any company in Cleveland, so if you're a Cleveland resident or a Cleveland company, you can go and connect with Jumpstart. There's a link on the Facebook page that allows you to access their cutting-edge research at no charge. If you're not a resident of Cleveland, that's not available to you. However, you can move to Cleveland, become a Browns fan, and access that research. So all those things have to happen in that order, right? So with no further ado, let me welcome somebody who's become a friend, a great knowledge leader in the space of blockchain. Give it up for Alex Tapscott.
Well, thanks, Bernie, for that great introduction. I'm delighted to be back in Cleveland. The last time I was here, I was 14 years old, and I was here for a hockey tournament. Now, Bernie mentioned Toronto, so I'm a Canadian, and I remember at the time I was planning on playing in this hockey tournament, and naturally we figured, well, we're going to the States, so these teams are going to be terrible, and we're going to win this tournament. And to our surprise, disappointment, they were actually pretty good. And we ended up losing in the finals. So Cleveland surprised me then, and it is surprising me now. With this incredible conference and the excitement around blockchain, everything that's been achieved in such a short period of time is really, really quite remarkable. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your enthusiasm. This is a very exciting time in human history. And that's because the world is entering a second digital age. Now, there are lots of new technologies that make up this new digital age, everything from artificial intelligence and machine learning to virtual reality to technology in our bodies. But there's one technology in particular that is going to have a greater influence than any other. And that's the technology behind cryptocurrencies. And of course, it's called the blockchain. I've been in this industry for years now, and after writing a book and conducting millions of dollars of research, we've become convinced that this technology really represents the second era of the internet. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original unique thing. You're sending a version, a copy, and you're retaining an original. So for something like email, for example, if you send an email to one person, you can send the same email to someone else. If you host a website, anybody can access it. If you put something into Twitter, if you make an entry into Wikipedia, it's available for all to see. So the internet is very much like a printing press for information. And generally speaking, that's a pretty good thing. Except when it comes to things that have value, assets, like money, being able to send copies is actually not a good thing, it's a terrible thing. So if I owe you, sir, $20 for something and I send it to you, it's important that when you have it, you know I don't have a version of that same $20 that I can send to someone else. Because if I can copy money in the same way that I can copy information, the money becomes worthless, and we have a crisis of trust. And so as a result, even though the internet has created all of this value, broadly speaking, we still basically rely on intermediaries, middlemen, who sit in the center of transactions and perform a whole bunch of really necessary steps. So these intermediaries would be familiar to many of you. Of course, there are banks and brokerages and governments. But increasingly, there's a new breed of intermediary, big social media companies, digital conglomerates, that basically anchor the digital economy. And these entities, they do some important stuff. They establish identity of parties in a transaction, they create trust, they perform business logic, clearing, settling, record keeping, contracting, all the stuff that makes commerce work. And overall, they do an okay job, but they have some very specific limitations. The first being that they're all centralized. And anything that is centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack. And we saw this recently with Starwood points. The second big issue is that they add friction and cost to all sorts of different kinds of transactions. So in the case of sending money overseas, it still takes days and costs 10% on average to move money across border, which is a funny thing when you think about it. We talk about the market for cross-border payments as if it's a thing, because it is. When was the last time anybody here sent a cross-border email or a cross-border tweet doesn't really exist. Information flows like water, but value, assets take time, they cost money, and there's friction. The third big issue is that they exclude big parts of the population. So there's a big unbanked population in the US and elsewhere in the developed world, but it's even larger in the developing world. And the fourth issue is that they capture data. Data that turns out is the most important asset class of the digital economy. Data is to our economy today what oil was to the industrial age. Except we all create this data, but we don't own it. It's owned by Facebook and Google and Amazon and your bank and your government. And that's deeply problematic because it means you can't use it, you can't monetize it, and it could end up in the wrong hands, as we've seen time and time again. So you can argue that even though the internet did create lots of value, a lot of that was captured asymmetrically by intermediaries. So what if the internet were entering a second era, from an internet of information to an internet of value, based on this new technology called the blockchain? So the blockchain is a term that we use to describe all blockchains. Of course, there are many different kinds of blockchains. Basically, a blockchain is a distributed network that has what's called a distributed ledger. And on that network, not just information like emails and PDFs, but assets, money, stocks and bonds, titles and deeds, even votes in an election, can be moved, stored, and managed peer-to-peer. And on these networks, trust is not established by an intermediary who sits in the middle. It's established through a combination of mass collaboration, consensus, and clever code, which is why we call blockchain the trust protocol. Now, the first implementation of blockchain was Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency. So who's heard of Bitcoin? Just raise, no, I'm just kidding. It's that thing that drug dealers use to buy guns on the internet. It actually turns out it's not that great for doing that because it's way more traceable than cash, prepaid cards, and a whole bunch of other types of payments. We can talk about that. No, Bitcoin was designed to be cash for the internet, a way to move value peer-to-peer without an intermediary. So if you imagine going to the Starbucks in the convention center here, you've got a $5 bill, you want to buy a coffee, and you hand that $5 bill to the merchant. They're not asking for your driver's license. You're not using the Visa network. It's not clearing through some technology system. It's not going through some mainframe. Cash is a bearer instrument. When the merchant has it, you don't have it. And when you have it, the merchant doesn't have it. Something like that didn't really exist online. There was no digital bearer instrument. And that's what Bitcoin set out to solve, in essence, to be cash for the internet. And what was interesting about it is that it worked. And it's worked so well that it's set off the spark, which is caught on like wildfire, as we've seen, and has captured people's imaginations. And it turns out that Bitcoin is really just the beginning. If you think about it this way, Bitcoin is like the first Nokia flip phone, in the sense that it was the first device that lots of people used that, in the case of the cell phone, for its mobile technology. In the case of this, it's digital assets. The next stage is the operating system of the future, which would be something like the iPhone, right? Who is going to create the iPhone of the future? One of the critical components of that is this technology called smart contracts. So a smart contract is basically computer code that mimics the logic of a business agreement, but with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, and where you don't need traditional intermediaries like banks and brokers and agents and lawyers to enforce the terms. So if you think about business, any business, your business, all of the different times where there's a business agreement between parties that requires intermediaries, where there's friction, imagine all of that being self-executing. Something like the stock market. Basically every single share in every single company is a contract entitling the bearer to a share of a common enterprise. So we can see how this can begin to change industries beyond just money. And one of the things that's really interesting is that it's actually not just about industries. It's also a technology that can transform how we do business, not just which businesses we do, but how we do business. So this is an economist. His name is Ronald Coase. And I'd like to know what he ate for breakfast every morning, because he lived till he was like 100. But he was best known, not for his longevity, but for his contribution to economics. And he won a Nobel Prize in the 1930s for writing a paper called The Theory of the Firm, and did a bunch of subsequent work after that. And in this paper, he basically said, why do we have companies? Why do firms exist? If the best way to organize capability is using the open market, allocating scarce resources, then why isn't everyone an independent contractor? How come companies do lots of different things? How come sales and marketing and procurement and management and manufacturing are all sort of inside the boundaries of a firm? And he said the reason And he won a Nobel Prize for answering it. The reason is transaction costs. As long as it's cheaper to do something inside the boundaries of a firm than in an open market, companies will grow, okay? So in the early days of capitalism, the Ford Motor Company or Standard Oil, which is started here in Cleveland, didn't just do one thing, right? The Ford Motor Company didn't just make cars. The Standard Oil Company didn't just refine oil. They did lots of things. In the case of the Ford Motor Company, they had a steel plant, a rubber plantation, a timber mill. They had a plant that put raw materials in one end and cars popped out the other. Because transaction costs in the market in 1910, 1920 were very, very high. And so it was cheaper to do things inside the boundaries of the firm. The internet came along a little bit later. Technology came along and helped progress, telecommunications, telemetry, and the internet, and made certain transaction costs much less expensive, right? So the cost of communicating over long distances became cheaper. The cost of searching for information became cheaper. So in the 90s and early 2000s, the mantra was focus on you do best and outsource the rest. Except if you look at the company today, and you can pick any company, your organization, ask yourself, does this company really look fundamentally different than it might have 25 years ago, if you were around back then? And you might say, well, on the margin, things have changed. You know, we've become more networked. But generally speaking, they look pretty similar. And that's because while the internet dropped the cost of search and communicating, it did very little to drop the transaction costs that really bind us together into these things called firms. And that's the cost of contracting, the cost of negotiating contracts, and the cost of establishing trust in business. In the 1980s, if you wanted to do a Skype call, you would have had to marshal the computing power of the NSA to do it. You know, you want to do a high-definition video conference call with you and someone on the other side of the world. Good luck trying to do that through your AT&T rotary dial, right? Today, we can do it for free. If you wanted to move money across border in the 1980s, you would find that the process is eerily similar to how it is today. So the cost of moving and storing and organizing information has dropped significantly. The cost of moving and storing and organizing value has not. So what does it mean for the economy and for business when those costs drop in the same way that the internet dropped information costs? Well, it turns out it leads to whole new models of organizing capability and whole new models of the firm. So in the book Blockchain Revolution, we talked about a new kind of entity called the distributed autonomous enterprise or distributed autonomous organization, which is this elegant combination of two of the big technology trends of the day, which is, of course, machine learning and AI and blockchain. So all of a sudden, you could have a bunch of agents on the internet. They may not even be people. They could be artificial intelligence, contracting, bidding, negotiating with each other in a way that's totally peer-to-peer and creating value in the process. So you'd have companies that might not have home offices. They might not have managers. They may not even have employees. But they do many of the things that traditional firms do today. And this is not just something that's going to affect any one industry like finance or manufacturing. This is something that is completely pervasive. And it's the reason why we launched the Blockchain Research Institute, which today is the largest blockchain think tank in the world. We count as our members dozens of Fortune 500 companies, and we're delighted, of course, to have the city of Cleveland as a strategic partner. Our research directors are made up of some of the leading experts in their field, people who have worked at the highest level in big companies as chief information officers and CTOs, others who have been pioneers in writing research and developing key concepts. Nick Szabo, who you may have heard from earlier today, is a partner and contributor of ours. We're very pleased to have him on board. Our membership is global, and it is across industries. We have companies from China, from Korea, from Europe, from the United States, from Canada. We have governments, we have NGOs, we have affiliate organizations. This is a really global movement, and it's amazing how fast things move in this space. So let's talk about some of the implications of all of this. So this is a Rube Goldberg machine. If anybody doesn't know what that is, it is a kind of a game. It's a complicated device that does a whole bunch of things. Some of them are kind of unnecessary and ridiculous, and in the end, it solves a very simple problem, like it closes a door, cracks an egg, or something like that. This is basically the way our financial industry works today. It's true. It's true. You know, if you go to Starbucks, let's say you didn't use $5, let's say you used your credit card, and you tap it on the card reader. I think you have those now in the US. And you think, wow, look, payments are digital. This is all happening in real time. Of course, that's not what's happening. That transaction is touching 4, 5, or 6 different computer systems, sometimes a lot more. There's the merchant's bank, there's your bank, there's the credit card company, there's a risk management company, there's Fed, ACH, there's, it goes on and on. There's lots of different parties. And the money doesn't land in the account of Starbucks right away. It takes days to clear and settle, and it costs them 2 to 3% in interchange fees. And those fees can be as high as 10%, depending on the merchant. How about you want to buy a share in a company? You call up your broker, you log into your E-Trade account, and you execute this transaction, and then within an hour or a few minutes, you see that the security is in your account, the money has been debited. And again, oh my God, financial services, so fast, so digital. Of course, that's not what's happening. That transaction may clear in 1 second, but the settlement process takes days, and it involves brokers, it involves exchanges, clearinghouses, custodians, and it costs you fees to do that. So in many respects, the innovation we've seen in finance and in a lot of other industries isn't really deep innovation. It's actually like digital wallpaper. The front end is innovative, but the back end is not. In the case of the financial markets, the technology and systems we use today are older than I am and older than probably half the people in this room. And it turns out that this is something that's not just going to affect stocks and payments, it's going to affect every single aspect of the industry, everything from accounting to how we finance new companies to how we access credit. Now, blockchain, I think I heard earlier on that there have been some sort of very technical speakers who've talked about this stuff, and I can appreciate that this is a subject that requires some level of depth of understanding. And it reminds me a lot of this old parable about the blind men and the elephant. So there's a bunch of men, they're all wearing blindfolds, and they're all feeling a different part of this elephant. And one person's feeling the trunk and says it feels like a wall, or sorry, the leg and says it feels like a wall. One person's touching the tail and says it feels like a rope. The other one's touching the trunk and saying, well, it feels like a snake. And that's kind of how it is with this technology. Something like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an asset. It goes up, it goes down. You can make money on it. That's kind of interesting. It's a cryptocurrency, a medium of exchange between people that allows them to move value peer-to-peer. That's a lot more interesting. But beneath that is this blockchain technology, which we can use to enable the movement of any kind of asset online peer-to-peer. And that, obviously, as I've said, represents huge shifts for companies and for businesses. One of the things that I think requires a little bit of demystification is this whole thing about crypto assets, right? So you hear about thousands of these different crypto assets, and you might wonder, quite rightly, what are these things? What do they do? Why should I care? And that's a very good question. If we have thousands of currencies, how is that different than the system we have today, where we have hundreds of different currencies for different nation states? That system doesn't seem to work that well. And the point here is that most of these digital assets are not currencies in the traditional sense. Some of them are. Some of them, like, say, Bitcoin is a currency. Monero, Zcash, Dash, Bitcoin Cash, or Bitcoin SV. These are designed to be a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account. That's what a currency is, and they sort of work. Bitcoin works better than the others, but a couple of those are quite interesting as well. But it turns out that there are lots of different other kinds of categories. So what's emerged over the past couple of years are these things called platform tokens. So Ethereum, who's heard of Ethereum? Yeah, quite a few people, eh? So Ethereum is one of Canada's most successful startups ever. Now, it's a global phenomenon today. There are 200,000 developers using its native coding language to build applications. It's not a Canadian company or a Canadian project. It's not a company at all. But a lot of its founding team was based in Toronto, and that's the genesis of this organization. Ethereum is different. So Ethereum, as I described earlier, if Bitcoin's the cell phone, Ethereum is the first smartphone. In the essence that it is a programmable device that allows you to run lots of different applications. So you can run an application that helps to manage a supply chain. You can run an application that helps you to move securities. It could be an application that you use to create a distributed storage network or a casino or a game or anything you want. And these platforms have become one of the fastest growing assets within this new asset class. The value of Ethereum has grown from $20–30 million to as high as $60 or $70 billion. Now today it's a lot less than that, but it's still hundreds of times greater than what it was when it started. And it benefits from these network effects. So the more applications that get built on the network, the more valuable the native token becomes, the more demand there is for it, and the higher the value of the network is. But Ethereum may be the first smartphone, to use that analogy again, but it might not be the last. It could be the BlackBerry of the blockchain world. right? Someone else could be the iPhone, and there's a few others that are emerging here. So the third kind of crypto asset are the tokens for the applications themselves that live on networks like Ethereum. So these are applications that do lots of different things. So I use storage as an example. So when we talk about the cloud, we're not really talking about, an actual cloud, obviously. We're not really even talking about sort of like a distributed storage network. We're really talking about giant data farms that belong to a few huge companies, right? That's what you're doing. When you're storing your data in the cloud, you're not storing it in the cloud, you're storing it with them. But it turns out there's more computing power and more storage in all of the devices that we all own and are latent in networks all around the world than there are in these very specific kinds of facilities. So how do we marshal all of that different computing power into a network that allows me to store information on this network or run computations on this network? Well, you need an incentive. So there are projects like Filecoin, for example, that have a native token that you can earn for putting your resources into this distributed cloud. And if you want to access data and you want to access computing power, then you have to pay in. So it's like creating a little economy within an application that if the application grows and becomes more popular, those assets could become more valuable. So those are kind of the weirdest of the two. And now we're going to get into some areas which I think might be more familiar to people. So securities, stocks, bonds, swaps, futures, forwards, all these kinds of different assets are basically just contracts. They are contracts. So in the case of a stock, it's a contract that entitles you to a share of a common enterprise, to a stream of cash flow if the company pays dividends, and to the ability, and it gives you the right to vote in certain aspects of the company's operations. And basically, all of that can be digitized and wrapped into a smart contract. So shares don't have to clear and settle through all those intermediaries I discussed earlier. They can become digital bearer instruments as well that we can trade peer-to-peer. And you want to do that because we don't want the cost and the friction and the time and all of the other effort, A. And B, it creates opportunities to create whole new kinds of securities. All of a sudden, small and medium-sized businesses in Cleveland and elsewhere can issue tokens that represent shares of their company to a global market and fund themselves. In many respects, this could put us on the forefront of a new age of entrepreneurship, where it doesn't matter where you are or who you are. If you have a good idea and you can market it effectively, you can raise money from anywhere. So geography becomes less important with the rise of blockchain. Now, there are other kinds of assets, things that have a tie to the real world, like real estate or oil or gold or timber, where you can automate the contracting language, but there's still delivery of a final product. Now, again, what's interesting about this is the new kinds of assets that it enables. So in Toronto, where I live, the housing market is very expensive. And it's very difficult for young people and young families to get a stake in the equity of that market. So there are companies, one in Toronto called CrowdMatrix, that is using blockchain to take houses and tokenize them into smaller parts. So instead of investing your money in one market or another, you can actually own a piece of the Toronto housing market. And that equity you can then roll into your house when you purchase it down the road. The sixth category are crypto collectibles. A crypto collectible. So with Bitcoin, there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoin. You may have heard that at some point today or in your life. The supply growth is known over time, and eventually it reaches a cap. If you think about a company like, I don't know, IBM or Apple or Microsoft, when you own shares, you own one of many shares that typically have the same exact rights as the next share. A collectible is a totally unique asset, one of a kind. And it turns out there are lots of one-of-a-kind assets in the world that we're used to, things like art or engagement rings or sports memorabilia. But there are also digital assets in the virtual world that are totally unique as well. So there's a company called CryptoKitties. Is anybody? Who's got a CryptoKitty? Can we give her a round of applause, please? I'm going to explain why in a minute. So CryptoKitties are virtual cats that you can buy, breed, own, trade, and everyone is totally unique. And this is a company that's actually raised a lot of money from some very prominent VCs like Andreessen Horowitz and a few others, and has become one of the sort of few scaled popular applications on the Ethereum network, which today is still pretty nascent. And basically, the idea is the cat you own is the only one of its kind. Now, earlier this year, at the peak of the crypto mania, someone actually paid a lot of money for a CryptoKitty. Well, a few people did, but one person in particular. One person spent about 120,000 US dollars on a CryptoKitty. So you might be asking, why? Other than having maybe too much money and an unhealthy love of cats. The reason anyone would spend anything on anything is that they would have to trust that it was scarce, right? In the same way that you spend money on a diamond ring because you know that they're relatively rare, or you would spend money on a piece of art because you know it's perhaps one of a kind. You trust that the CryptoKitty is unique because cryptography says so. There is only ever going to be one of any of these given assets, just like there's only going to ever be 21 million Bitcoin. So all of a sudden, you can start to think about what kind of virtual assets could be enabled using this technology. I'm sure people here are familiar with the game Fortnite. Yeah? Nods. There's a lot of parents who are like looking at their credit card bills and wondering where all their money is gone. So Fortnite was just valued at $12 billion, the video game. That's 20 million weekly active users. It's a global phenomenon. And its business model is not that you pay money to play the game, it's that you pay for things inside of the game. You pay for assets inside of the game, power upgrades, weaponry, whatever, all these kinds of things. And that's true in a lot of different video games, by the way. There's sort of these pay-to-play or freemium style models where you're constantly upgrading and paying for assets. The market for those virtual assets is almost as large as the market for cryptocurrencies, if you can capture all of those digital assets. So what's interesting, though, is that if Fortnite, the game company, if the company that owns it shuts down, you're going to lose all your assets. They could upgrade the game and change your ownership. You actually have no claim on any of those things. There's no economic right to any of those things. But you can imagine if those assets were crypto assets, you'd be able to migrate them out of the game, sell them to other people in a market, or maybe even use them in another gaming ecosystem. So if anyone's ever read the book Ready Player One or seen the Steven Spielberg movie, it's sort of the idea of this metaverse where virtual assets can migrate around virtual worlds. And right now, there are actually companies like Decentraland that are building virtual worlds and selling off virtual real estate that have actual economic rights based on the blockchain. So what seems like a small market can actually become one that's tremendous in size. The final category of these 7 is crypto fiat currencies and what's called stable coins. So crypto fiat currency is a virtual currency or cryptocurrency issued by a government, nation state, central bank, etc. And this is a good idea for a couple of reasons. It would reduce friction and the complexity of the financial services industry. It could broaden the franchise of people to access money. They might not need a bank account. If they have a device, the connection to the internet, they can access this. And it could potentially improve the quality of monetary policy. So if you wanted to cut interest rates or raise interest rates for whatever reason, you'd be able to see in real time how money is flowing through the system and be able to react and adapt more quickly. So this is an opportunity for central banks to innovate. And central banks have actually been fairly innovative in the past. The Fed's automated clearinghouse system, ACH, was cutting edge at its time in 1974. And so now I think it's time for an upgrade. So 7 different kinds of crypto assets, which is one aspect of financial services, which is one of many different industries that could be transformed by blockchain. So let's move beyond assets and talk about real business processes. So we all know about the sharing economy, right? Companies like Uber and Airbnb and TaskRabbit. We all get together and we share, and in the end, we kind of participate in the upside. And it's sort of a nice idea, this idea of a sharing economy. Except the only problem is it's not really true. These companies are not successful because they share. They're successful because they don't share. Uber is not a sharing economy company, it's an aggregator. It aggregates excess capacity, drivers, cars, fares, through a central intermediary, and then sells it to a marketplace. And if it can get a monopoly in a given city, all the better, which is why cities that have Lyft and Uber generally have better rates and happier drivers than ones that have only one of the two. So if you think about Uber, which apparently is going to go public next year for around $100 billion, I take Uber all the time. I'm not participating in that $100 billion, and neither are the drivers. So nobody's sharing in this. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad business model. It's a great business model for Uber. It's just not a sharing economy model. So how could blockchain technology enable us to change this? So you can imagine, instead of Uber, that we have more of a networked alternative. So Uber basically does 4 things: identity, reputation, contracting, and payments. Identity: who's the driver, what's his name, what's his location. Same with you. Identity, reputation. What's his rating? How many rides has he got? How many hours does he have under his belt? What's he known for? Or what's she known for? The same goes for you. Contracting: when you get in an Uber, get taken to where you want to go, you pay. If you don't get picked up, if the driver cancels, you don't pay. That's a business agreement that Uber, as the intermediary, is actually settling on your behalf. The 4th thing is payments, integrated into the back end, or Visa, direct debit, whatever, that allow you to execute a transaction. All 4 of those things can be changed with blockchain. So identity and reputation. Well, instead of your data living inside of Uber and a million other companies, you could own your own sovereign identity and decide how it gets used in a given situation. And that identity could actually be way more rich and interesting than whatever Uber happens to know about you. Except it's not like you have to share it. You can just attest to its validity. Contracting. Well, you can use a smart contract to enable a transaction to occur. So I want to get picked up. I need to have a car with lots of seats. I need to take a toll road because I'm late for a meeting. I can put all those terms into a smart contract which can self-execute. And then payments. Well, you could either have a native cryptocurrency or an existing cryptocurrency, or you could just use regular money to enable a payment to occur as well. Another industry is the creative industry of media, art, film, etc. So the way that this model used to work is that if you were an artist, you would sign with a label, and they would produce your music, market it, sell it, etc. And in the end, you would get a small piece of the royalties, 4 or 5%. Maybe if you were Frank Sinatra, you could get a bit more, but typically not that much more. And it wasn't a model that made most artists rich. It made a few artists rich, but it didn't make most artists rich. But it worked pretty well. You could be a working musician and have a middle-class lifestyle. Now, the internet came along, and it was supposed to actually make this model much better, because you could sell your music basically peer-to-peer. You could engage with your customers, and you wouldn't need the label as the intermediary. Except that's not what the internet did, is it? The internet took something that was an asset, a record or a CD or a tape deck, and turned it into a free commodity that could be put through the printing press of the internet until its value was basically nothing. Now, a bunch of new intermediaries came in, Spotify and Apple Music and the streaming services, and they solved some of the problem in that certain artists are getting paid again, mostly for helping them build their brand, and labels are profitable again, but the average performing artist is making less than they ever have. So in the 1980s, if you wrote a hit single and it sold 1 million copies, you would probably have a 4% royalty on that. Now, let's say the single sold for $1 a copy, you're talking $40,000 in 1985. So not a fortune, but enough to have a normal middle-class lifestyle. Today, that same song streams on Spotify 1 million times. You don't get paid $40,000. Does anybody know how much you get paid? $35. So basically, the income from a middle-class lifestyle reduced to the cost of a pizza, right? A nice pizza, but still a pizza. I don't know, pizza might be cheaper in Cleveland. Now, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, just to be clear, right? One, you're buying something, you own it. The other one, you're listening to it once. You may listen to it 100 times, right? In the same way you might listen to a CD 100 times. But the math just doesn't add up. So there are companies out there that are using blockchain to try and solve this problem. And there's one artist in particular who we've worked really closely with at the Blockchain Research Institute. Her name is Imogen Heap. And she's sold millions of copies of her records over the years and has been nominated for Grammys in the process. And she's built this technology, or this community called Mycelia. Now, the idea behind this is pretty simple. A song is already digital. Music is already digital, right? You got music and the lyrics and the artwork and everything that you see when you listen to something on Spotify or Apple Music. So why can't a song also be an asset? Why can't it have contracting language built in? So every time you listen to it, it creates a payment stream that goes not to a bunch of different intermediaries, but gets split according to who owns the rights. So all of a sudden, artists can go from being paid last, if they get paid at all, to being paid first and getting paid fairly, hopefully. And this is something that I know personally. My father-in-law is a composer for film and TV, and he had a couple of shows that were really popular in the 90s, and they still syndicate all around the world to this day, in places like Italy and South Korea and elsewhere. And he relies on an agent who manages his royalties in Canada to manage another manager who manages the royalties in these foreign markets. And he was owed a significant amount of money, except the average time it takes from when a content is consumed to when a royalty check gets paid is between 12 and 18 months. So in that 12 to 18 months, one of the agents in Italy went bankrupt, and he lost out on the money. So this is, we're talking about a market, like, again, back to digital wallpaper. The front end, the Spotify experience is pretty seamless, just like tapping your card is pretty seamless. But on the back end, it's a deeply troubled and very antiquated system, and it affects real people. Speaking of this, intermediaries. So stock markets, banks, and other traditional financial intermediaries capture value by being in the middle and creating trust. And now we're seeing the emergence of new kinds of intermediaries. Apper is a really interesting company. It sort of has two different aspects to its business. One is investing, and the other one is payments and remittances. And you can use this app as a way to move value across borders without it costing you 10% at the Western Union counter. Supply chain is another really interesting use case. So every single year, there's around $500 billion of supply chain fraud in the global economy. It takes lots of different forms. Goods don't arrive on time, the order's incomplete, the goods are fraudulent, taxes aren't paid, duties aren't levied, what have you. And that's a real cost on the participants in that supply chain, and it's something that's borne ultimately by the end consumer. And it's problematic because all of these different systems that are used in the supply chain are basically siloed. So one entity might know what's happening with the state of an asset. Where's my stuff, as someone in the industry explained to me, but everyone else doesn't. So if we were able to use blockchain as a way to trace and track assets that move through supply chains, and everyone could share that information and trust that it was accurate, just like we can trust when we know someone owns one crypto asset that someone else does not, then we'd be able to have much better clarity into the state of a supply chain at any point in time. In fact, supply chains would go from supply chains to asset chains, because really it wouldn't be about what the supplier is doing, it'd be about where the asset is and what the asset's state is at any point in time. So Everledger is a company that's doing this with diamonds, but I'm sure you've seen Walmart as well has launched with IBM's blockchain to do this with all of its produce suppliers. And it's a shame it didn't launch 6 months ago before this romaine scare. So what happens with a lot of these produce is that they go through one or two centralized facilities, and then they get spread out into a market. And things like organic groceries, organic produce, are basically like farmed in one valley in California. So it may be that 1 in a million heads of romaine lettuce are contaminated, but nobody can know for sure which one, so they say don't eat romaine at Thanksgiving. And I'm, by the way, as an aside, I'm kind of convinced that this whole romaine thing was, something that was cooked up by all the dads and uncles of the world to make sure there was no salad at the dinner table at Thanksgiving. It's like, oh, I guess we're going to have to eat, marshmallows on top of, potato with gravy instead. No, I shouldn't joke about this. But so using this as a way to trace and track the progeny and the provenance of assets, such as a shipment of produce or a diamond or a barrel of oil, has profound implications for the economy, for human health, and for other issues. The Internet of Things, this idea that we're going to be connected by trillions of devices that do everything, I think these devices are going to need a way to move and store data and information and value to each other peer-to-peer in a frictionless and secure way, because we don't want every single device you own or you're connected to be a vulnerable hacking point where you could lose all your information. And also, there are practical use cases where we want the device itself to be able to make a payment. So if you have a light bulb in your house that's metering power from your neighbor's solar panel, you want that transaction to be peer-to-peer. You want basically the light bulb to have its own bank account, right? It's not exactly a bank account, but it's a way for it to buy power peer-to-peer. We actually can't scale the Internet of Things without an Internet of value. And so this is true in the power market. I'm going to just move ahead here because there's some things I want to talk about. So we've talked about data. Data, the most important asset class of the digital economy. And this is an analogy I sort of like to use, which is, in many respects, we live in sort of a period of digital feudalism, where we have these landlords that own sort of all the value. They own the land, they own the means of production. And we're all working the land. We're all out there creating and producing all of this data. And in the end, all of that data then gets owned by the landlords. And in the end, we get access to a few sort of services, free services like Facebook. And this is sort of a Faustian bargain, the trade-off that we made, where we said, okay, we're okay giving up our data in exchange for free services. But I think this year especially, people have kind of decided, you know what, maybe this is actually a bad bargain for me. Maybe all these companies are getting really, really rich, and I'm losing my privacy in the process. And it's not right. So I think we can move to a new kind of model, one that's focused on the individual. So what blockchain enables is a sovereign identity. So basically the idea that you as an individual can own and control your own information, and you decide how it gets used in a given situation. So you want to buy something on the internet. It's not actually necessary that the merchant knows who you are. You know, if you go to Walgreens, buy whatever, they don't ask you for your driver's license if you're going to pay with cash, right? They just want to know you have the money. So I think with a lot of transactions on the internet, retail merchant transactions, there's no need for all of this personal information about yourself, your date of birth, your credit card number, your address, to be floating out in the ether like that. You should be able to own and control it. Now, there are other examples where you do need to share more information. Obviously, you want to open a bank account, you want to get a loan to buy a house, or you want to get an insurance policy. You need to share more information. An actuary is not going to underwrite an insurance policy unless they know something about you, right? But in this case, it's up to you to decide how your information gets used. It's not up to someone else who owns it to share it with that company without your knowledge. And so this is an idea of moving back to a privacy-first model. And I, by the way, think that privacy is foundational to a free society. I think anybody who says privacy is dead is deeply misinformed. And I think that this could be one of the killer apps of blockchain, is for us to take back some aspect of our privacy. The final thing of these 8 different business models is what this means for the public sector. So one of the things that we can do with blockchain is make government work better, faster, cheaper, more efficiently, which is something that should be a bipartisan issue in any part of the world. Or tripartisan when you have more than 2 parties, which you do like everywhere else other than the US. Or quadpartisan, no, I don't even know if that's a word. So the internet helped to change government a little bit. Some services we were able to access online. Maybe you could get your driver's license renewed or your prescription filled, or whatever, using the internet. But the actual way in which government functions today is pretty similar to how it did 25 years ago. And I think that in many respects, that's because people in government saw the internet as maybe insecure, as not reliable for certain use cases where things like identity and privacy are really important. And they were right in some ways and wrong in others. But the point is that blockchain helps to address these issues. So there are actually more things that we can do with blockchain than we could do with the internet when it comes to government. And that can help improve the delivery of services at a lower price. The second thing is how we could use this to change our democracy. So e-voting, online voting, is something that has been bandied around for 25, 30 years. As long as there's been an internet, there's been an idea about e-voting. But it turns out that the internet itself is actually not really ideal for voting. When you vote, it's important that your vote gets cast, that it gets cast for the person who you intended, that it gets counted only once, that the results are verifiable, but that they also remain private and anonymous, right? Sort of the 5 requirements. The internet doesn't really do that great on all of those. Centralized databases can get hacked and numbers can be moved around. People's identities can be exposed and their privacy, compromised. There are all these different problems with this. But it turns out that blockchain is actually really well suited for this. I actually spent a year and a half as an advisor to Elections Canada. And the research that was conducted through Elections Canada basically showed that improving access to voting broadens participation. Might seem obvious, but that was the insight. And that the people who didn't vote because they weren't able to access voting stations were typically young people, new immigrants, or lower income. So, people who sort of were boxed out of the process. Now, it's my view, and I think a view that's shared pretty widely, that the more participation you have in an election, the more legitimate the outcome, right? This most recent midterm had twice the participation of the last midterm. I think people really felt like democracy was working a bit better this time around. If we can improve the quality of delivery of voting, then we can improve the quality of democracy. And there's actually a company here in Cleveland called Votum, which is one of the companies that's on the forefront of this. They've already done this in the real world for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Radio Hall of Fame, and they're now rolling it out to some other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So something to keep an eye on, and something that I think the city of Cleveland should be very proud of. The final thing is central banking. We've kind of talked about this a little bit. One thing I didn't mention is that sovereign cryptocurrencies or crypto fiat currencies, actually, one of them kind of exists in Venezuela. The government claims to have created this thing called the Petro, which is a crypto fiat currency you can use to pay for things in Venezuela. Now, if anybody's familiar with the economy of Venezuela, it doesn't really work that well. It's really tragic, ultimately. I mean, it's this country that's got all this bounty of natural resources, but it's a complete disarray. And it suffered from hyperinflation, and that's because there's corruption and no accountability in government, among other things. So I'm not saying that the Petro is going to succeed or that it's worth spending a lot of time looking at, but I think it's interesting that a country like Venezuela was the one who decided to do this first. Now, maybe it was a get-rich quick scheme by people inside of the government. There's also a real reason to do this. If you're under sanction by the US government, that means you can't clear and settle transactions in US dollars through US banks. And the US dollar is still the reserve currency of the world, which means it's harder for you to, sell oil, for example, in global markets. So countries like Venezuela, and I think probably countries like Iran and maybe Russia, will begin to look at this really seriously. And that means that we have to too. So that's 8 different business models transforming 8 different industries. Now, not everyone is as optimistic as I am about this. I don't really know how you square rat poison. You figure the rat poison just on its own will get the job done, but apparently you can square it. Look, Warren Buffett's a very smart guy. It's not to poke fun at him, but this is not someone who's really involved in this industry. Doesn't really have a feel for technology. He's admitted many times he missed the internet era. Made his first investment in Apple this year, just as they decided to not disclose their iPhone sales. So that's probably peaked out. But we've seen this throughout history where leaders of old paradigms sometimes react to new ones with a mix of emotions. Sometimes they ignore it, sometimes they deride it, sometimes they're openly hostile. And we've seen this play out time and time again. Now, not every big new hot thing turns out to be a big new hot thing, but the response, regardless, is always pretty much the same thing. So still, we should acknowledge the criticism or the issues that could potentially derail any new technology or any new idea that has great potential and possibility and also good intentions. So in the book, we dedicated a whole chapter to this. We basically said, look, there are lots of reasons blockchain could succeed. There are many reasons why it might not. And there were so many that we said it needs a whole chapter. So they are, not to go through them all, but the technology itself. Today, blockchain technology is improving rapidly, but is not yet at the point where it can take on all of the different things that I've discussed today. In some cases it can, in some cases it can't. The technology itself needs to scale to meet the demands and requirements of today's business. Now, if you think about the internet in the 1990s, 1995, a year and a half or 2 years after the launch of Netscape, the first sort of commercial web browser, people said the internet's never going to do this or it's never going to do that. People in the media business said no one's going to read the newspaper on the internet because it takes a minute to download a web page, whereas it takes 1 second to open up a newspaper or a glossy magazine. And that's the reason that the internet is never going to be successful. In 1995, you could not have launched Netflix as a streaming service because the internet could barely handle text and images, let alone high-speed, high-definition video content. Of course, these technology challenges are overcome, or they are usually, by smart and ambitious and thoughtful technologists and entrepreneurs who really want to see this improve. Still, today this needs to happen. How will incumbents react? How will the traditional intermediaries that I've discussed who capture a lot of this value react? And I think that they could kind of do so in a few different ways, right? One is to say, I'm going to ignore this isn't relevant to my business. Wouldn't advise that because I think it's relevant to all business. The second thing they could say is, well, maybe I can use this. Maybe I can kind of co-opt the blockchain to make my business run faster and cheaper and more efficiently, and that will allow me to cut costs and drive my profits higher. That's interesting. I think that's probably a necessary requirement. You need to make it real in the enterprise before you can think about the future. But if you only think about how you can save costs in your business today, you're going to miss out on how the technology might change your business in the future. I've seen studies that say blockchain could cut X number of billions of dollars from the securities market. Well, what happens when there is no securities market to cut costs from in the traditional sense? What happens when transactions are happening peer-to-peer? So if you only focus on the present, then you're going to miss out on the future. How will governments react? This is a very fascinating topic because the reaction really covers the whole spectrum. In some places in the world, like in China, they're hostile to Bitcoin, crypto, but they're open to blockchain. Sort of a difficult dichotomy to reconcile, if you ask me. In other parts of the world, they're super supportive of everything. I think that Cleveland and Ohio has shown real leadership in this regard. I think that if you see what the state did in allowing people to pay their taxes in Bitcoin. Now, I'm not sure how many Ohioans are going to pay their taxes in Bitcoin. I think it could be a lot. I think it might not be a lot at the beginning, but it demonstrates a commitment to innovation and shows that the city and the state are a model user of technology. So these are issues. They could be showstoppers, right? But I think in many respects they're implementation challenges. They're things that need to be overcome, and we've seen how they've been overcome in the past and how they're happening today. So in the early part of this year, during the World Cup, I guess it would have been the early summer, we said, what if we did a bracket for cities all around the world to see who's leading in the blockchain revolution? And admittedly, this was only like a week after I met Bernie Moreno, and had I known him for longer, they probably would have gotten a shot at participating in this because he's a force into his own right. And if I'd known what was going on in Cleveland, maybe we would have considered it. But if you look at these different cities, and I hope you can read them all, they're very different. Okay, so they're traditional centers of innovation, things like San Francisco, Silicon Valley, New York City, Tokyo, Shanghai, et cetera. There are other kinds of places like Toronto, Canada, which sort of has emerged quietly as one of the leading cities. And then there are sort of different kinds of places like Zug and Zurich, which you might not think of as a leader, but actually won this competition. And they all have a few different things that work for them. There's a basic minimum requirement to make your city an ecosystem for innovation or for anything. You need, the rule of law, you need property rights, democracy's help. It's good when you have a great university system with a pipeline of talent. It's also great when you can attract talent from either inside of a country or from outside of a country. It's great when you have big companies that are willing to support startups at the local level. There are a few large companies in Cleveland who could help to accelerate innovation by becoming the first customer of a lot of great startups. You need governments who are open to innovation, and that means smart rules and regulations and policies, but it also means stepping up as a model user of technology, which sends a great signal to the market. And most of all, you need entrepreneurs. You need companies and people who are risk takers, who are willing to do the crazy thing and try and change the world. And I think that I sincerely hope that in a year when I'm back here speaking to you, that we will be talking about Cleveland's emergence as one of those blockchain hubs. So I'll end with this note. There's an old parable about the invention of chess. It kind of goes something like this. The king of the land is given this gift, the game of chess, by this guy. And he says to the inventor, what a wonderful thing. I will grant you anything in the kingdom, whatever you want as a reward. And the inventor says, sire, you know, I'm a humble man of humble means, and I have humble needs, and all I really want is some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second, 4 grains on the third, 8 grains on the fourth, and so on and so forth. And the king, who I gather is like not a math guy, it's like, yeah, whatever, 8, 16, that's when he stops counting. How much rice could that be? A barrel of rice, a bag of rice? Your wish is granted. Of course, 16 becomes 32, becomes 64, becomes 128, 256, 512, etc. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the kingdom produces in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, they got the smoke machine going before I'm leaving the stage. By the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the whole planet Earth in 6 feet of rice. So that's the way it works with technology. Things start slow, but then they move like this. And I think in many respects, the first digital era, the period that took us from the invention of the computer to the rise of the internet and the mobile web, really was sort of like the first half of the chessboard. The world in 2018 is unrecognizable, the world of 1958, in terms of the technology we have, the tools we use. So what will the next half of the chessboard look like? It's my hope that you'll be part of that change and that Cleveland will be a leader in the blockchain revolution. Thank you very much.